Welcome to Spoonful of History. In this video, you're going to learn everything about the history of semiconductors and how they run your smartphones and computers. By the end, you'll know it like the back of your hand. But I have one concern. Honestly, you probably won't make it to the end of this video, because you're going to get sleepy. This story goes all the way back to ancient times, and you're about to hear a lot of terms you've never even heard of before. Are you ready? Let's get started. Strategic resources are the key assets that a country or a company must have to reach their long-term goals and stay ahead of the competition. It is not just about having a large supply of something. It is about having the specific things that give you an advantage. If you don't have these resources, you risk falling behind in the global economy, losing your military strength, or failing to keep up with new technology. We can see how this works by looking back at ancient times. Back then, one of the most important strategic resources in the world was silk. But silk was much more than just a piece of fabric. Because it was rare, shimmering, and very difficult to make, it was a luxury item that proved you had wealth and influence. In short, silk was money, and silk was power. It was so valuable that people used it to pay their taxes to the government. Leaders gave it as expensive gifts to build alliances with other countries, and they even used it as a bribe to stop enemies from starting a war. In those days, a single roll of silk was so precious that it could be worth as much as a horse. As time went on, strategic resources kept changing. Let's jump ahead to the age of exploration. In Europe at that time, spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves weren't just for cooking. They were as valuable as gold. The problem was that Europeans couldn't grow these spices themselves. On top of that, their food storage was terrible. Spices were essential because they masked the smell of spoiled meat and helped preserve food so it would last longer. People even believed that pepper could prevent and cure diseases. To them, spices weren't just a luxury. They were tools for survival. In the 16th century, people used to say, "A single bag of spices could buy a whole house." Because the value was so high, European countries were willing to risk their lives at sea just to find them. This desperate search for spices is what built the great sea powers like Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and England. Back then, the most important strategic resources weren't oil or gold. Just a handful of peppercorns was enough to shake up the entire world and change history forever. As time moved into the 17th and 18th centuries, a new strategic resource emerged, and it was porcelain. In European royal courts and among the wealthy, porcelain from the East became incredibly popular. It was so expensive and highly valued that it sometimes cost even more than its weight in gold. At that time, Europe simply lacked the technology to make it. They couldn't replicate that thin, translucent, yet incredibly strong material that only craftsmen in the East knew how to produce. Because it was so hard to get, high-quality porcelain from China and Japan became the ultimate status symbol for European nobles. It wasn't just about having a few plates, either. Royalty went to extreme lengths to show off their wealth, even building special rooms called porcelain cabinets just to showcase their exquisite collections from the East. To the Europeans of that era, owning porcelain wasn't just about art. It was about owning a piece of a secret technology that the rest of the world hadn't mastered yet. Building on this obsession with porcelain, we can see how it even led to conflict. In 1592, Japan invaded Korea, and it wasn't just a battle for land. It was a war to seize strategic resources. Japan already knew the massive value of East Asian porcelain through their trade with Europe. At the time, Joseon porcelain, from what is now Korea, was considered top-notch in both art and technique, making it highly valued in Europe as well. Inside Japan, tea culture was booming, and the demand for high-quality porcelain was rising fast. However, Japan didn't yet have the skills to make porcelain at that elite level. This is why Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who launched the invasion, made capturing Korean potters one of his primary goals. During the war, Japan forcibly took hundreds of skilled Korean potters back to their own country. These craftsmen were scattered across Japan and became the true foundation of the Japanese porcelain industry. In fact, world-famous brands like Satsuma, Arita, and Nabeshima all started from this forced transfer of knowledge. This is exactly why historians sometimes call this conflict the Porcelain War. It proves that a major reason for the war was to seize the most valuable resource of that time, the technology of porcelain. So, when do we finally talk about semiconductors? You're still awake? Impressive. Now, don't whine. This is where it all begins. Just like silk, spices, and porcelain defined the past, semiconductors are the most important strategic resource of the 21st century. Think about it. The fact that you can watch this video right now on your phone or computer is all thanks to semiconductors. They are the brain inside every piece of technology we touch. Without them, our modern world would simply stop. Even massive platforms like YouTube and the entire digital life we take for granted couldn't exist without these tiny chips. A semiconductor is, quite literally, right in the middle between a material that lets electricity flow and one that doesn't. That's why it's called a semiconductor. To understand this, think about how electricity works. It flows easily through conductors like copper or gold, where electrons are free to move around. On the other hand, it doesn't flow at all through insulators like glass or rubber because their electrons are tightly bound and stuck in place. A semiconductor is special because it is neither a full conductor nor a full insulator. It can let electricity flow or stop it completely. Think of it like a material with a built-in switch that you can turn on and off whenever you want. This simple property is exactly why semiconductors are at the heart of every electronic device. Take your smartphone, for example. Inside that device, tiny semiconductors are flipping billions of these on and off switches every single second to process your apps and videos. For those who still don't quite get it, don't worry. I'll explain the science of semiconductors in more detail. There's a lot of dry stuff coming up, so it'll definitely help you fall asleep, if you aren't careful. To be precise, a semiconductor is a material that conducts electricity, or blocks it, depending on the conditions. The most common example is silicon. Yep, that's right. Silicon you can easily find in ordinary sand. But we're not talking about the sand in your backyard. They use very clean, high-quality sand. When you heat it up really hot, it melts and turns into a metal-like material. It's kind of like sifting flour over and over to get really fine particles. Semiconductor silicon has to be super pure, so it goes through countless rounds of cleaning and refining. But the silicon we've got so far isn't finished yet. Next, it's melted down again and cooled, really, really slowly. Why so slow? Because we need a single, perfectly clean piece of silicon. This process makes a long, shiny silicon cylinder, which looks a bit like a giant silver sausage. Now, if you slice that silicon cylinder thin, like cutting ham, you get what we call a silicon wafer. It's a thin, palm-sized disc with a surface so smooth and shiny that it looks absolutely flawless. This wafer is like the blank canvas for a semiconductor chip. On top of this, super thin wires, much thinner than a human hair, are layered to create microscopic circuits. It's not just one or two layers. The circuits stack up in dozens of layers, forming a highly complex structure. It's like building a massive, miniature city. Once the circuit process is done, the wafer is cut into small squares. These tiny pieces are the semiconductor chips we use. They go into smartphones, laptops, cars, even air conditioners. The number of chips per wafer depends on size and design, but usually there are hundreds, sometimes even thousands on a single wafer. This may sound simple, but in reality, creating a single semiconductor chip requires 8 major processes, what we call the 8 essential steps. It's not a simple factory line where you just run a machine and a finished product pops out. Each stage is incredibly delicate, requiring precision at the atomic level, and even a single speck of dust can ruin the entire batch. At this point, you might be wondering, what exactly does a semiconductor chip do inside all these devices? To answer that, we first need to look at a microscopic component that plays the most important role inside the chip. It's called a transistor. A transistor is, simply put, a nanoscale switch that decides whether electricity can flow or not. In the digital world, there are only 2 states. If electricity flows, it's a 1. If it's blocked, it's a 0. But what's really cool is the speed. These switches flip between on and off so fast that it's almost impossible for the human mind to imagine. This sheer speed is exactly what allows you to stream 4K videos and play high-end games without a single glitch. Even at this very moment, billions of these minute switches are blinking on and off inside your device, working non-stop to power your screen. But what do billions of switches really do? And what do those ones and zeros actually mean? Let's dive a bit deeper into transistors. To really understand them, we need to look at how computers actually work. Understanding how computers were born, how they evolved, and how they perform seemingly impossible tasks using nothing but zeros and ones makes everything fall into place. So, where do we start? This story goes all the way back to the time of Napoleon. Yes, that's right, the Napoleon of the French Empire. After the French Revolution, and once the chaos finally settled, France started trying to expand its influence across Europe again. But there was one big problem standing in the way. It was Britain, France's most annoying rival. Napoleon kept looking for a way to weaken Britain, and in 1798, he made a move that seemed a little unexpected. He launched a military expedition to Egypt. But why Egypt? Because it was the key route connecting Britain to India, one of its most important colonies. If France took control of Egypt, Britain would be cut off from India, and Napoleon even believed that France might have a chance to take India itself. Of course, as you probably know, it didn't work out. The campaign dragged on for 2 years, but in the end, it collapsed under the power of the British Navy. But, interestingly, Napoleon brought along a team of 167 scholars on this expedition. It was not a military operation. It was basically a giant research team traveling with the army. And they're the ones who discovered the Rosetta Stone, the famous stone that finally helped us read Egyptian hieroglyphs. It was an unexpected achievement born from a failed military campaign. What's even more interesting is that Napoleon's expedition brought back these gorgeous silk shawls from Egypt. And they weren't just trophies of war. At the time, Europe was obsessed with this whole Orientalism craze, a fascination with anything that felt exotic or mysterious from the East. So the moment these luxurious shawls arrived in France, people went wild for them, and they instantly became the hottest fashion item in all of Europe. So, of course, people thought they could make a fortune selling them and began looking for ways to mass-produce these shawls. Then, there was a French weaver named Joseph-Marie Jacquard. He was barely getting by making military uniforms during the French Revolution, but one day he got an idea from a music box, the kind that plays melodies using a metal disc with holes in it. He thought a weaving machine could move automatically in the same way. He had observed how mechanical music boxes used rotating cylinders with pins to program a specific melody. Jacquard realized that if a machine could store the instructions for a song, it could also store the instructions for a pattern. And that's how the weaving machine that used punch cards was born. It's called Jacquard loom. You'd punch holes into a card to code the pattern in advance. Wherever there was a hole, the needle would go through and let the thread rise, and wherever there wasn't a hole, the needle would be blocked. As a result, the machine could automatically weave the pattern on its own. Looking back now, it was basically an early form of programming. But the problem was that this new technology wasn't exactly welcomed by the weavers of the time. The Jacquard machine was too good at its job, and workers feared it would take away their livelihoods. That fear turned into anxiety, and that anxiety eventually turned into anger, to the point where some workers actually smashed the machines. And Jacquard was even nearly killed by angry laborers. It was a clear reminder that whenever a new technology appears, resistance from people often follows. And that hasn't changed even today. About 200 years later, something similar happened in Korea. In 2018, when a new platform service like Uber tried to enter the market, the taxi industry fought back hard. The conflict got so intense that one taxi driver even set himself on fire in front of the National Assembly. He was rushed to the hospital, but didn't survive. Whether it was because of that event or not, the reality is that services like Uber still aren't available in Korea today. Anyway, Jacquard's punch cards didn't stay as just a tool for making fabric. Over time, the power of those tiny holes began to spread in ways no one could have imagined. Back then, people saw, probably for the first time, that a machine could read information. The holes in the cards decided how the machine moved. Where there was a hole, a needle passed through. Where there wasn't, it stopped. That little difference in movement stacked up over and over, eventually forming complex patterns. Each hole on a punch card acted as a piece of information. A single card could contain hundreds of holes arranged in a specific pattern, and just changing that arrangement created a completely different design. In a way, the punch card was a set of instructions, and the machine was simply reading it, interpreting it, and following it. Before that, machines were basically just tools that pushed, pulled, and repeated motions. But the Jacquard loom was different. It could follow a preset pattern all on its own. And the source of all those instructions came from just two states, hole or no hole. Those two simple states would later become the only and the most important numbers in computers, 1 and 0. So why do 1 and 0 matter so much? The smartphones, computers, and tablets we use every day seem to perform incredibly complex tasks, but when you look inside, it's all built on one surprisingly simple idea. It only needs to tell the difference between 1 and 0. Just like humans can write poems, novels, and even insults using only 26 letters of the alphabet, computers describe the world using just two numbers. While humans make often mistakes, computers are far more reliable. They only need to tell two states apart, so there's very little room for confusion. Of course, computers aren't completely error-free, but compared to humans, they're about as close to perfect as it gets. So why were computers designed to use only two numbers? Wouldn't it be more efficient to use all 10 digits from 0 to 9? At first glance, that sounds reasonable, but in reality, it's not that simple. After all, computers are machines that run on electricity. And electricity is more delicate than you might think. It can fluctuate slightly, get interference, and even change its state depending on the environment, like temperature and humidity. Imagine if we try to represent all 10 digits from 0 to 9 using electricity. You'd have to split voltage into very fine levels. A slightly higher voltage would mean 1, a bit higher would mean 2, and a very high voltage would mean 9. But the problem is, electricity doesn't behave that nicely. If the voltage shifts even a little from heat or noise, what was supposed to be a 7 might drop to 6.8. and now the computer can't tell if it's a 6 or a 7. So engineers in the past came to a simple conclusion, using only two states that are easy to tell apart, something clearly there or clearly not there. If electricity is definitely present, that's a 1. If it's not there at all, that's a 0. With only two clear levels, even if the signal wiggles a bit or picks up noise, the computer is far less likely to get confused. So computers chose certainty over efficiency, and that's why they use a very simple system of just ones and zeros. There's no deep mathematical meaning. They were simply the best way for a computer to represent electrical states. But then the question is, how can just two numbers handle really complex tasks? To find the answer, we need to understand the number system we use and the one computers use. We use decimal, or base 10. It has 10 digits from 0 to 9. Why base 10? Funny as it may sound, it's because humans have 10 fingers. Really? Since ancient times, people have been counting on their fingers, and when they reached 10, they would move to the next place value. From 0 to 9 is one digit, then after 9 comes 10, and after 99 comes 100. A number system that changes place value based on 10 is called decimal. But computers only use two numbers, 1 and 0. This is called binary. In decimal, after 9 comes 10. In binary, after 1 comes 10, then 11, 100, 101, 110, 111, and then 1000, and so on. Let's look at some examples. Decimal 0 is binary 0, and decimal 1 is binary 1. Same so far, because binary also has 0 and 1. But decimal 2 is binary 10. Decimal 3 is 11. Decimal 4 is 100. Decimal 5 is 101. Decimal 6 is 110. And decimal 7 is 111. Then decimal 8? All three digits are full of ones, so we need to add another place. So in binary, that's 1000. Now, numbers are fine, but how do we represent language using binary? To do that, we need a code that turns letters into numbers. That code is called ASCII, and it was created in the US in the early 1960s. For example, A is 65. B is 66. A question mark is 63, and a space is 32. Each letter or symbol gets its own decimal number, which the computer then converts into binary to process. But there was a problem. ASCII could only handle English and a few symbols. To fix this, Unicode was created. It can represent almost every character in the world, even emojis. So, how does a computer actually read Unicode? Let's say you press the A key on your keyboard. Every key has its own number, called a key code. When you press it, the keyboard sends a signal saying, "This key was pressed." But the signal doesn't say A. It sends that specific key code. Then, your operating system, like Windows or Mac, thinks, that number represents the letter A. But it doesn't just store A as a letter. It translates it into the international standard Unicode and recognizes it as U plus 0041. But wait, there's one more step. The computer doesn't use that code directly. It turns it into binary. For example, A becomes 01000001. These are the actual numbers that move around inside your device. By sending these ones and zeros as electrical signals to store data, perform calculations, and render images on your screen, a semiconductor chip brings technology to life. And deep inside that chip, there is a microscopic component that makes it all possible. That is the transistor. Let's look at how chips have evolved with the iPhone. That's because the transistor plays the most critical role inside the chip. The first iPhone came out in 2007. Back then, smartphones weren't nearly as complex as they are now. Inside, there were just a few semiconductor chips. One handled processing and calculations. Another stored photos, music, and apps, and there were separate chips for calls and internet connection. Altogether, there were about 6 to 10 chips, and inside each one, there were tens of millions of tiny switches that turn electricity on and off. Those switches are the transistors. The chip that performs the main work in a smartphone is the AP, or application processor. You can think of it as the brain of your phone. The application processor in the first iPhone was about 6 by 6 millimeters, roughly the size of a fingernail. Inside, there were around 25 million transistors. Back then, it was amazing technology. 25 million transistors on something the size of a fingernail. You can imagine how tiny each transistor must be, far too small to see with the naked eye. So, how about the iPhone 17, which came out in 2025? Apple and TSMC, the company that makes Apple's chips, haven't officially shared the exact specs, but industry experts say the AP contains over 20 billion transistors. And the chip's exact size is unknown to the public, but it's probably about the same as chips in previous iPhones. Basically, how advanced a chip depends on how many transistors you can pack into a tiny piece of silicon. The more transistors, the more tasks it can handle, and the faster it can perform them. Ultimately, the performance of a semiconductor comes down to the number of transistors. The history of the chip industry is essentially a battle to fit more and more transistors into smaller and smaller spaces. And this battle isn't going away. In fact, it's only getting fiercer. But what were computers like before transistors? When nobody could dream of squeezing billions of transistors into a chip, computers worked in a completely different way. At that time, the idea of a semiconductor chip didn't even exist, and the word transistor wasn't even in our vocabulary. Instead, people relied on a quite primitive calculating machine. And what's surprising is it wasn't made by a scientist or an engineer. It was built by a worker at the U.S. Census Bureau. In the late 1800s, the U.S. was swept by a massive wave of immigration, and the population was exploding. Conducting the census started to take an enormous amount of time. The U.S. has been doing a nationwide census every 10 years ever since gaining independence in the 1790s. The 9th census, in 1870, took 5 years to complete, and the 10th, in 1880, took 7. But even worse, the 11th census, in 1890, was expected to take more than 10 years. That meant the next census might have to start before the previous results were even published. Faced with this problem, the U.S. Census Bureau launched a challenge, searching for a faster way to process the data. 3 inventors competed, and a young Census Bureau employee, 30-year-old Herman Hollerith, overwhelmed the other contestants and won. What he invented was called a tabulating machine. It stored letters, numbers, and symbols on punch cards, and the machine read those cards to process the data. Wait, punch cards? Doesn't that sound familiar? Exactly. It was the same logic used by the Jacquard loom, which had been created to mass-produce those silk shawls brought back from Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. Of course, the tabulating machine worked very differently from the Jacquard loom, but it's true that Hollerith drew inspiration from it. You could say that if the Jacquard loom's punch cards were the birth of programming, then Hollerith's punch cards marked the beginning of fast data processing. Thanks to this tabulating machine, the census could be carried out far more quickly and accurately. As a result, Hollerith secured the exclusive right to supply his machines to the Census Bureau. Building on that success, he went on to found a company called the Tabulating Machine Company, or TMC. TMC didn't just sell machines, it leased them and made steady money selling punch cards, the consumables. It's basically the same model modern printer companies use, where the real profits come from ink and toner. After that, TMC went through a series of mergers with 3 other companies and was reborn as CTR, the Computing, Tabulating, Recording Company. Then, in 1924, CTR changed its name once again and grew into a titan that would shape the early days of the computer industry. That company was IBM. A small machine invented by a census clerk had evolved into a vast computing empire. For people back then, Hollerith's tabulating machine felt like magic. Before this, census work was a grueling manual task, counting by hand, writing on paper, and checking it all over again. It was endless, exhausting work. As the population grew, the process slowed to a crawl, and errors became increasingly frequent. But finally, this was taken over by machines, and the 1890 census proved just how powerful the tabulating machine was. What was expected to take nearly 10 years was finished in just 2.5. Over time, however, Hollerith's machine began to show its limits. Society was changing fast, and the data people needed to record was growing rapidly. Eventually, punching holes in cards could no longer keep up. Even a single census produced tens of millions of cards, and year after year, they just kept piling up. The problem wasn't just the volume. Storing them became a daunting challenge. If a card was damaged, the data was lost forever. Above all, Hollerith's machine was purely mechanical. It relied entirely on moving parts, needles, springs, gears, and metal levers clicking and clanking as they worked. But mechanical parts wear out, accuracy slips, and maintenance becomes a burden. As the world grew more complex, the machines slowed down. As always, humanity was ready for a new technology. Just as the tabulating machine was reaching its peak, a new technology started to emerge. Instead of moving parts, it used electrical signals, computing at speeds no mechanical machine could ever hope to match. If you're expecting this to be the moment the transistor appears, sorry to disappoint. Unfortunately, the transistor was still about 40 years away. But what if the transistor had appeared 40 years earlier? The digital world we live in today might have arrived much sooner. We'd probably be using devices that are much smaller, yet far more powerful. In the history of computers, there's an invention just as important as the transistor. It is the vacuum tube. This small device was the key that unlocked the door, moving us away from mechanical gears and into the age of electronic computing. Unlike its predecessors, which relied on the physical movement of springs and levers, electronic computers worked using electrical signals. Invented in 1904 by British engineer John Fleming, the vacuum tube looked much like a simple light bulb, a hollow glass chamber with all the air removed. Inside, it could control the flow of electrons, letting them pass or stopping them completely. In other words, this was the first time computers had an electronic switch, something that could turn signals on and off as ones and zeros. And there was a computer that proved how powerful this idea could be. Its name was Colossus. During World War II, the German military used 2 different ciphers. One was Enigma, used for daily communication among soldiers and officers. The other was Lawrence, far more complex and far more secure. Lawrence was used only by the highest-ranking German officers and Hitler's direct command. Ordinary soldiers had no access to its messages. It carried extremely sensitive information, enough to change Germany's strategy and even the course of the war. The Germans believed it was impossible for humans to crack. However, the British built a computer to break this code. It was named Colossus. It's a massive machine with over 2,000 vacuum tubes and could read 5,000 characters per second. That speed was unimaginable at the time. With Colossus, the British were able to monitor the German High Command's plans and orders almost in real time. It didn't stop there. They could track German troop locations, unit movements, and supply lines. Most importantly, in early 1944, when planning the Normandy landings, they were able to see where German defenses were, where coastal guns were placed, and how armored units were moving. Thanks to Colossus, the Allies were able to successfully land over 150,000 troops on the beaches of Normandy. As a result, Germany had to fight on two fronts at the same time, against the Soviets in the east and the Allies in the west. The German forces had no choice but to be spread thin, and this became a decisive factor in the Allies' victory. In fact, historians say that by breaking the German codes, Colossus helped shorten World War II by at least 1 to 2 years. In a war that claimed 80 million lives, it is estimated that Colossus may have saved more than 10 million people. If you had to pick two things that brought World War II to an end, it would be Colossus and the atomic bomb. Both were created by some of the smartest minds of the time, but the ways they ended the war were completely different. Computers using vacuum tubes were groundbreaking for their time, but over the years, their weaknesses became clear. The vacuum tube used in Colossus was about 3 centimeters in diameter and 15 centimeters long. Colossus had over 2,000 of these tubes, so you can imagine how massive the computer was. It filled an entire room, and that was just for a computer performing only code breaking. ENIAC, the world's first programmable general-purpose computer, was even much larger. It used over 17,000 vacuum tubes, stretched 30 meters long, stood 2.4 meters high, and weighed around 30 tons. And the heat generated by a computer this dinosaur-sized was immense. The whole room would get as hot as a sauna. To keep it from overheating, cooling systems had to be installed throughout the room. Its power consumption was enormous as well. Running ENIAC for just 1 hour required 150 kilowatts, roughly the same amount of electricity that about 60 average households use in a day. Among 17,000 vacuum tubes in this gigantic machine, dozens failed each day. Over 30 people were needed just to keep it running. Clearly, it was still far too big and demanding for anyone to own personally. Today, computers and smartphones let us send messages, watch videos, and play games with just a tap. It feels completely normal now, but the computers in the vacuum tube era were a far cry from what we have today. Back then, computers could run only one program at a time. To do anything else, the machine had to be rewired from scratch. Even switching from addition to multiplication required pulling out hundreds of cables, resetting panels, and restarting the entire system. Changing a program was almost the same as rebuilding the machine itself. But then, someone came along with an idea that changed everything. That person was John von Neumann. John von Neumann was a Hungarian-born Jew who emigrated to the United States in the 1930s, escaping Nazi persecution. From a very young age, he showed extraordinary talent. He could recall books word for word after a single reading and solve complex math problems entirely in his head. He wasn't just a genius. He had a mind that seemed almost unreal. People called him the smartest man on earth. He made major contributions across many fields, including mathematics, economics, and physics. And he was also part of the Manhattan Project, which led to the development of the atomic bomb. Above all, he was the first to propose storing programs and data in the same memory, with the processor reading and executing them step by step. This idea became the foundation of modern computers. In other words, Programs, memory, and the CPU now functioned as a single system. The program defines what the computer should do. Memory stores both the program and the data, and the CPU reads instructions from memory and executes them one step at a time. With this design, the days of rebuilding the entire machine for every new task were over. You simply loaded a new program into memory, and the computer could carry out the task on its own and produce results. But for von Neumann's vision to truly work in the real world, a new kind of hardware was required. Now, can you guess what it was? Yes, you're right. It was the transistor. Throughout human history, there have been a few inventions that completely reshaped the way we live. The first was fire. Once humans learned to control it, everything changed. Cooking food reduced the risk of disease, and fire made it possible to stay active even after the sun went down. Then came the wheel. With its invention, transportation was reborn, and the movement of the world began to accelerate. Heavy objects could be moved far more easily, and people were able to travel longer distances, opening the door to wider interaction and exchange between communities. And then there was the printing press. Before it, books had to be copied by hand, one by one. Printing made it possible to spread information quickly and on a massive scale. Knowledge was no longer reserved for a small elite. Ordinary people could read, learn, and think for themselves. The printing press also played a crucial role in events like the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. But then, what was the greatest invention of the 20th century? It's definitely the transistor. Almost everything we take for granted today, smartphones, computers, the internet, medical devices, military technology, electronics in cars, even artificial intelligence, would simply not exist without it. The transistor didn't just improve technology. It opened the door to an entirely new world, fundamentally different from anything that came before. About 40 years after the vacuum tube appeared, the transistor was invented in 1947 by 3 scientists at Bell Labs in the United States. At first, people were simply amazed by its size. But it wasn't just smaller. Compared to vacuum tubes, the transistor consumed far less power, generated much less heat, and, most importantly, almost never failed. At the time, a single computer cost as much as 50 houses, so owning one was beyond imagination for any individual. But the invention of the transistor turned the impossible into the inevitable. Computers that once weighed over 30 tons and filled an entire room could one day fit on a personal desk. Early transistors, however, were still a long way from the tiny, sophisticated chips we know today. They used needle-like electrodes that had to be carefully aligned by hand. It was about the size of a thumbnail, and compared to the transistors packed inside today's semiconductor chips, it was nothing more than a crude chunk of metal. Back then, computers had only hundreds, or at most a few thousand transistors. Today, the smartphone in your pocket contains over 10 billion. This is far more than the total number of transistors used across the entire 1950s and 1960s. Their size shrank from something as big as a fingertip to something invisible to the human eye. And at the same time, their performance improved beyond comparison. So how did this kind of miracle become possible? The history of semiconductors is, in a word, a 70-year-long race to make things smaller. In the beginning, even building a transistor the size of a fingertip felt like a miracle. But scientists and engineers didn't stop there. They kept pushing to shrink them further and further, because the smaller the size gets, the less power it consumes, the faster it becomes, and the amount of transistors you can cram onto a single silicon wafer increases dramatically. But the problem was, there's a limit to the precision that human hands can achieve. Back in the day, When people were manually aligning those needle-like electrodes on transistors, it was absolutely impossible to create the ultra-tiny semiconductor chips we have today. So, once again, the industry found itself facing a huge challenge. And it ended up finding the solution in a completely unexpected place. It was photography. Simply put, photography is all about using light to capture an image, and then putting that image onto paper. Here's how photos were made in the past. There's a special material that reacts to light, called photoresist. They spread it onto a base, which is a bit thicker than paper. When you click the shutter, light hits this chemical, and it changes based on the light's brightness. Dark spots turn black. Bright spots stay light. The entire light pattern gets perfectly transferred to the surface. After that, you use chemicals to lock the image in place, and that's how you get the finished photo. They took this idea, leaving a trace based on how much light hits a surface, and applied it to the semiconductor industry. This technique is called photolithography. Photography uses light to put a scene onto paper, but photolithography uses light to put transistors onto a silicon wafer. If you look closely at a semiconductor chip through a microscope, you'll see countless, incredibly thin lines running everywhere. These lines are the pathways that allow transistors to send and receive electrical signals to each other. And those pathways and transistors come together in massive numbers to form the circuit. And there is a machine that uses light to print these complex circuits, much like a camera taking a photo. It's called lithography machine. Currently, there are two main types of lithography machines used to make semiconductors. One uses deep ultraviolet, DUV, light, and the other uses extreme ultraviolet, EUV, light. The DUV machines are mostly used to make chips that need relatively bigger circuits and high stability. You can think of things like image sensors and the chips that go into cars. While several companies can manufacture DUV equipment, the names you may hear most often are Nikon and Canon from Japan. However, to manufacture the most advanced chips, like the application processors in smartphones or the CPUs and GPUs in computers, deep ultraviolet light isn't enough. It requires extreme ultraviolet light, or EUV, which has a much shorter wavelength. And there's only one company in the world capable of building EUV lithography machines, and that is ASML from the Netherlands. A single one of these EUV machines costs around $300 million, and ASML is the only supplier. Companies like TSMC, Intel, and Samsung are major customers, because without ASML's EUV machines, it's absolutely impossible to manufacture cutting-edge semiconductors. Have you ever heard of the nanometer process, or nanoscale manufacturing? 1 nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. A human hair is about 90,000 nanometers thick, so we're talking about something roughly 90,000 times thinner than a strand of hair. In semiconductor chips, the nanometer number refers to how thin the transistors and the wiring can be made. So, the smaller the number, the thinner and denser those structures can be packed. Currently, technology has advanced all the way to the 3-nanometer process. Taiwan's TSMC and South Korea's Samsung are the leading companies producing chips at the 3-nanometer level. The industry is, now, expected to reach 2 nanometers in the near future, followed by 1.4 nanometers after that. And the technology that makes all of this possible is photolithography. Semiconductors are among the most difficult products on Earth to manufacture. Making a single chip requires 8 major processes, and each one involves dozens of highly complex steps. No single company could possibly master all of it on its own. It would be impossible without hacking an alien civilization's technology. That's because you have to be the best in the world across nearly 200 different fields to pull off the entire process. EUV lithography is just one step out of the 8 stages. But to build a monster machine like this, a company must be world-class in physics, optics, chemistry, robotics, and thermodynamics, all at the same time. When this machine operates, the mirrors that reflect the light must be flat down to the atomic level, and they have to move with precision far beyond what any human hand could achieve. And the light itself, extreme ultraviolet, is hotter than the surface of the sun. To control it, the entire system has to operate in an almost perfect vacuum. If a single speck of dust gets inside, the entire machine has to be shut down. ASML spent more than 30 years developing this machine, and there isn't a single company in the world that has been able to catch up. Today's semiconductor isn't just a small piece of silicon. It's a monster created by thousands of industries working together. This naturally led to a global division of expertise. Everyone focused on what they do best and became number one in that field. And at the top of this division are the companies that complete all the process. These companies are TSMC, Samsung, and Intel, who are currently the world's #1 semiconductor manufacturers. Now, if you're thinking, hold on, TSMC and Samsung? I thought NVIDIA was the world's #1 semiconductor company. That is also correct. Currently, NVIDIA is the most valuable company not just among semiconductor firms, but among all corporations in the world. But that doesn't mean what I said was wrong either. TSMC, Samsung, and Intel are indeed #1. They are the leaders among semiconductor manufacturers. To fully understand what this means, we need to take a look at how the semiconductor industry has developed over time. The history of the semiconductor industry splits into 2 very different paths. One is the path of memory. The other is the path of thinking. Every electronic device, smartphones, AI servers, self-driving cars, contains semiconductors. But what do they actually do? By now, we know they convert electrical signals to ones and zeros. But what does that really mean? Inside a device, semiconductors do just 2 things: remembering and thinking. The chips responsible for remembering are called memory semiconductors, and the chips responsible for thinking are called logic semiconductors, or system semiconductors. Until the 1960s, computers were quite good at calculating, but they still struggled to store data. Memory chips didn't exist yet, so early machines relied on crude methods. One example was magnetic core memory. It was made by threading thousands of thin iron rings and using their magnetization to store data as ones and zeros. But the problem was that this kind of device was too large, too expensive to build, and too slow. Even after the transistor was invented, computers at that time were still large enough to fill an entire room. And the main reason for this was memory. For example, the core memory of the IBM 1401, released in 1959, had a capacity of just 4 kilobytes. Yet that tiny 4 kilobytes came in a box about 60 centimeters wide and deep, and it weighed tens of kilograms. Compared to the 8 gigabytes of memory in today's smartphones, it was vastly larger in size, yet its capacity was 2 million times smaller. Thanks to transistors, the size of the CPU kept getting smaller, but the memory was still tied to older technology. This made it difficult to continue scaling down the size of the computer. For computers to truly move forward, they badly needed a new kind of memory, smaller, cheaper, and much faster. This growing bottleneck was solved by a young IBM engineer, Robert Dennard. He began to question the complex structure of the memory. He started thinking about how computers actually worked and asked himself, why is memory so complex? In the end, it only needs to store ones and zeros. So, he challenged the prevailing method that everyone took for granted and attempted a design no one had ever imagined. He believed that memory could be created with just one tiny cell to store electricity and one switch to control the flow of electricity into and out of that cell. Finally, in 1966, he invented a revolutionary storage device. It consisted of just two simple components: a single transistor to act as a switch, and a tiny capacitor to serve as an electricity reservoir. This was the birth of DRAM, or Dynamic Random Access Memory. The principle behind DRAM is incredibly simple. If the capacitor is charged with electricity, it represents a 1. And if it is empty, it represents a 0. Previously, tens of components were required to build a single memory cell, but DRAM needed only two: the transistor and the capacitor. This idea changed everything. Memory could be made smaller and cheaper, and most importantly, it could be mass-produced. So, the price of memory collapsed, the size shrank by hundreds of times, and the performance became much faster. As a result, the computer that once occupied an entire room could sit on a desk, paving the way for the age of laptops and smartphones. The invention of DRAM was more than just the creation of a better storage device. It was the decisive moment that opened the door for humanity to enter the digital age. And, thanks to DRAM, smartphones can handle multiple apps running at once. Computers can execute several programs simultaneously without lagging, and AI servers can process enormous amounts of data in real time. When buying a PC, you've probably seen the detailed specifications list RAM as 16 gigabytes or 32 gigabytes. This means that the computer's DRAM can store 16 gigabytes or 32 gigabytes of data. You might be thinking, wait, it only stores that much? Computers usually store at least 100 gigabytes. Of course, you are right. Computers actually have two types of storage that work in different ways. One is incredibly fast, but quickly forgets it. And the other is less fast, but keeps information almost forever. And DRAM is not a device that stores data permanently. It's more like a temporary workspace where data is lost when the computer's power is turned off. It functions as a high-speed work area where the computer pulls out and places the data it needs at the moment. Therefore, the capacity of DRAM determines how many tasks the computer can perform simultaneously. The greater the capacity, the more tasks your computer can handle at once. And the location from which the RAM retrieves data is the SSD, solid-state drive. When you hear specs like 500 gigabytes or 1 terabyte, those numbers refer to the capacity of this SSD, which stores data using a different kind of chip, and it's called NAND flash memory. If DRAM is volatile memory, meaning the data is lost when the power is off, NAND flash is non-volatile, meaning the data does not disappear even when the power is disconnected. We don't lose the photos or files stored on our smartphones when we turn them off. This is because those files are stored in the NAND flash. When a computer runs a program, it first transfers the data stored in NAND flash memory over to the DRAM. Computations are then performed on the DRAM. After that, any data that's no longer needed is erased, while the rest is sent back to NAND flash. In this way, DRAM and NAND flash are the two pillars responsible for memory within a computer. NAND flash is a type of flash memory. But today, almost all storage devices in smartphones and computers are built with it. Because of that, the terms flash memory and NAND flash are often used interchangeably. They basically mean the same thing now. In the past, computers used HDDs, hard disk drives, as their main storage. Inside an HDD, metal disks spin at high speed, while a needle-like head moves across the surface to read data. It worked well and it could store a lot of information. But it was heavy, sensitive to shocks, and noisy. More than anything, it was still a mechanical system. The disks had to spin, and the head had to move, and that made it too slow. No matter how fast the DRAM was, the HDD could not keep up, which slowed down the overall speed of the computer. That is why modern PCs rarely use HDDs, opting instead for the much faster SSD. And what is inside this SSD is the NAND flash chip. It was invented in the late 1980s by Fujio Masuoka and Masao Ohashi at the Japanese company Toshiba. But it didn't really take off until the mid-2000s. As devices like USB drives, digital cameras, and MP3 players became popular, people needed storage that was small, lightweight, and could keep data even when the power was off. That was the moment NAND flash truly began to shine. MP3 players in particular quickly moved away from HDD format and switched to NAND flash format. Because it was smaller, resistant to shock, consumed less power, and was much more convenient to carry around. As this technology continued to advance, storage capacity increased explosively, and prices fell rapidly. Eventually, personal computers also moved away from those spinning disks and adopted SSDs, built entirely from semiconductor chips. Compared to hard drives, they are dozens of times faster, completely silent, and far more resistant to shock. While memory chips serve as the computer's storage, another type of semiconductor allows it to think and make decisions. These are known as logic chips, the brains of the digital world. When you take a photo on your smartphone, play a game, or watch a YouTube video, an enormous amount of computation is happening behind the scenes. It decides how to arrange every single pixel on your screen, analyzes audio to generate real-time captions, and identifies, for example, whether a camera sees a person or a car. It even determines how an AI model, like ChatGPT, should formulate its response to your question. All of these complex tasks are processed almost instantly. Memory chips cannot do any of that. Their job is simply to store data. Think of them as a workbench, and on that workbench, logic chips handle all the decision-making and processing. They are at work inside almost every electronic device around us. For example, inside a smartphone, they handle communication, determine image quality, and manage power efficiently. In cars, their role is even more critical. Dozens of control units manage everything from the engine and brakes to airbags, cameras, radar systems, and battery management. These chips constantly read sensor data, make decisions, and control the vehicle in real time. And in the age of AI, they also play the most crucial role in data centers. They are used for training massive AI models that perform trillions of computations every second. Above all, the most important logic chips are the ones inside the CPU and GPU. Both act as the brains of computers, smartphones, and AI servers. CPUs and GPUs are thinking chips, but they process information in different ways. If the CPU is a small team of highly skilled experts, the GPU is more like a huge crew of thousands working together at the same time. A CPU is made up of several small processing units called cores. Modern CPUs often have 4, 8, or sometimes 16 or more. Each core is a master of logic, specialized in handling complex commands and coordinating sequences. This allows the CPU to juggle multiple tasks at once, like browsing the web, editing a document, and streaming music, all without missing a beat. That's why the CPU is described as the overall manager of a computer. By contrast, a GPU is built from hundreds or even thousands of cores. Each core is simpler than a CPU core, but together they form an enormous team. It's not one genius, but a vast number of people doing the same task at the same time. Because of this structure, the GPU is more specialized in processing a huge volume of calculations in parallel at once. For example, generating reflections of light and casting shadows in 3D games is something the GPU does far better than the CPU. We've seen the roles of both memory and logic semiconductors so far. As chips have become more specialized, and as modern devices demand far more complex tasks, the center of the semiconductor industry has been gradually shifting from memory to logic chips. Because simply storing data is no longer enough. Especially as smartphones and AI continue to advance, the importance of logic semiconductors has grown more than ever before. Currently, the leaders in the logic semiconductor industry are NVIDIA and TSMC, but their roles couldn't be more different. NVIDIA focuses entirely on designing chips, while TSMC is dedicated exclusively to their manufacturing. Before we dive deeper into TSMC, let's take a look at the current state of the memory semiconductor industry. Memory chips have a relatively simple structure, and their operating mechanism is standardized. This allows them to be produced using the Integrated Device Manufacturer, or IDM, model. In this model, one company handles both the design and the manufacturing. In fact, the current memory chip industry is dominated by just 3 companies: Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix, and Micron. All of them operate as IDMs. While many players once competed in this space, only these 3 giants remain today. Because only companies with massive capital, cutting-edge technology, and large-scale production can survive in this market. A semiconductor factory is called a fabrication plant, or fab for short, and building one costs an enormous amount of money. At a minimum, it takes around $20 to $30 billion, and for the latest manufacturing processes, the cost can exceed $50 billion. And it doesn't end once the fab is built. The equipment has to be constantly upgraded, chips must be tested, and sample products need to be sent to customers, all of which require tremendous investment every year. This isn't an industry where a new company can casually jump in. And just because the equipment is in place doesn't mean you can start making chips. Saying that manufacturing is simpler than logic chips doesn't mean it's easy to make. The technical barriers are so high that you can't even get started without technology accumulated over decades. And in this market, price determines everything. Without economies of scale, even a successful company can go bankrupt. When DRAM and NAND flash prices crash, profits built up over years can vanish in an instant, turning into losses of billions of dollars. This is why only the big 3 managed to survive. They have overwhelming production capacity, the financial stamina to handle excess inventory during downturns, and the power to crush competitors in price wars. And even with huge investments and advanced technology, newcomers face a daunting reality. They might not find anyone to buy their products because the market is already saturated. The buyers tend to trust only these 3 companies that have proven their reliability over many years. In the world of memory chips, there are only 2 kinds: DRAM and NAND flash. These products are highly standardized, and customer requirements don't vary much. However, compared to this, the logic sector is a completely different world. Beyond CPUs and GPUs, there are hundreds of different types of chips. Each one is designed to perform a specific function, and their internal circuits are so complex that designing them is like planning an entire city. With tens of billions of transistors inside, every detail is a masterpiece of technology. Engineers carefully map out every electrical path and decide which tasks the chip should handle first. They also have to find the perfect speed for the chip to run. This whole design process is so complex, it takes years to finish. This complexity naturally led to the rise of companies that focus exclusively on design. AMD, Qualcomm, MediaTek, and Broadcom are prime examples. They don't have any fabrication plants, so they're called fabless companies. Apple also designs the chips used in its own products, so it can be considered a fabless as well. However, Apple is not the global leader in this field. That title belongs to NVIDIA, which currently holds the top position in GPU architecture and AI chip design in the world. But the fabless sector has a much lower barrier to entry for newcomers, since they don't need to build factories. And because there are so many different types of chips, the competition is also far more intense than in the memory market. Consequently, these companies focus only on what they do best and leave the actual manufacturing to firms known as foundries. A foundry is a company that manufactures chips on behalf of fabless firms. They don't design chips of their own. Instead, they focus all of their capabilities solely on the technology of manufacturing. As logic chips have grown increasingly complex and diversified, and designing chips is now just as difficult as making them, the industry has naturally shifted toward a division of labor. Future-shaping industries like AI, autonomous driving, and robotics require enormous computing power. And since logic chips are responsible for this, the importance of both fabless and foundries continues to grow. What really matters for a foundry is its ability to produce ultra-fine circuits with high, stable yields. Even with the same design, a chip made with a 5-nanometer process is fundamentally different from one made with a 28-nanometer process. As the process node gets smaller, chips deliver better performance and consume less power. And this allows for higher transistor density, packing more computing power into a smaller space. However, pulling this off is incredibly difficult, so there are only a handful of companies in the world that can actually do it. In this field, TSMC is the undisputed leader, followed by Samsung Electronics. Samsung is an IDM that produces both memory and logic chips, while also operating as a foundry. Although it is chasing TSMC closely in technology, there is still a significant gap between the two. Samsung mainly produces chips like Exynos for its own Galaxy smartphones and handles some orders from Qualcomm. However, most high-end chips, such as NVIDIA's GPUs, are manufactured by TSMC. Samsung continues to invest heavily in technology development to win orders from NVIDIA, and some analysts predict that Samsung could overtake TSMC at the 2-nanometer node. But for now, TSMC remains dominant in every aspect. TSMC was founded by Morris Chang. His family fled China in 1949, escaping the newly established communist regime, and eventually immigrated to the United States. Chang first enrolled at Harvard University, but transferred to MIT in his sophomore year. After graduation, he built his career at a company called Sylvania, before moving to Texas Instruments, the leading semiconductor firm at the time. Recognizing his potential, Texas Instruments supported him in earning a PhD at Stanford University. Eventually, Chang rose to the position of Senior Vice President in charge of the global semiconductor business. Meanwhile, the Taiwanese government began to recognize the huge potential of the semiconductor industry and came with a plan to make it the nation's flagship sector. But they lacked the technical leadership to turn this vision into reality. To fill this gap, they turned to Morris Chang, a man who had already built a legendary career in the American semiconductor industry. He was the perfect person for the job. The Taiwanese government approached him several times with ambitious offers, but each time he declined, unwilling to walk away from the life and career he had built in the U.S. Even after leaving Texas Instruments in 1983, Morris Chang chose to join General Instrument instead of returning to Taiwan. However, the government did not give up. They persistently pursued him, and finally, in 1985, Chiang accepted the position as the first president of ITRI, a government-funded research institute, and boarded a plane to Taiwan. After joining it, Morris Chiang began by setting the overall direction for Taiwan's semiconductor industry. He anticipated that many chip companies would struggle to build and maintain fabs due to the staggering investment costs and technical complexities. Consequently, he concluded that focusing solely on manufacturing with advanced process technology would be the key to success. He had a keen insight into the future of the foundry service market. Finally, in 1987, TSMC was established with investment from the Taiwan National Development Fund. This was the birth of the fabless foundry model. It became the world's first pure-play foundry, a company that does manufacturing only, with no chip design of its own. At first, many people were skeptical, questioning, can a semiconductor company without its own designs really succeed? But over time, that doubt completely disappeared. It became clear that chip design and manufacturing are fundamentally different disciplines. TSMC focused intensely on advancing its process technology, pushing into nanometer-scale manufacturing, improving yields, and building highly stable production capabilities. This focus allowed the company to grow rapidly. Over time, TSMC became more than just a manufacturer. It emerged as the backbone of the global semiconductor industry. Starting from the mid-2000s, the number of fabless companies began to grow fast. Without owning their own fabs, they only designed the chips and outsourced all production to TSMC. As a result, the fabless foundry structure became the industry standard. This shift enabled new design firms to enter the market with relatively low initial costs, leading to the wide expansion of the entire semiconductor industry. Today, TSMC stands as the ultimate manufacturing partner that fabless companies rely on. Giants like NVIDIA, Apple, Qualcomm, AMD, and MediaTek send their designs to the Taiwanese foundry to bring their chips to life. In particular, NVIDIA's latest AI accelerators and GPUs, such as the H100, H200, B100, and B200, are all produced at TSMC's leading-edge fabs. No matter how brilliant NVIDIA's designs are, they are meaningless without a company capable of manufacturing them. Since TSMC is virtually the only company on Earth with the expertise to execute this, the two have become indispensable partners to each other. NVIDIA's rise to become the world's leading AI company is often credited to Jensen Huang's vision and leadership. But many people also point out that without TSMC's manufacturing capabilities, NVIDIA's growth would not have been possible. TSMC still does not produce any chips under its own brand. This stems from their core philosophy: never compete with customers. Built on this foundation of trust, nearly all the chips in the smart devices we use today are born within the facilities of this Taiwanese company. However, what makes this company truly exceptional is not just its technology. Although Taiwan acts as a de facto independent nation, China has never recognized its sovereignty, maintaining that the island is an inseparable part of China that must eventually be reunified. This tension has lasted for decades, but it has become much more complicated because of semiconductors. In the past, Taiwan was mainly a political symbol for China, but today its value is on a whole new level, with TSMC standing at the very center. Taiwan is no longer just a small island, it is the heart of global digital civilization. This is a big problem for Beijing. To advance their AI, autonomous driving, and supercomputing, they need the world's most advanced chips. However, the technology to produce them is concentrated in Taiwan. And what's even worse for China is Taiwan maintains much closer ties with the United States. For China, the obsession with Taiwan goes beyond history, national pride, and political unity. Behind these reasons lies a very practical plan: semiconductor hegemony. If they were to take control of Taiwan, it wouldn't just be gaining territory. It would be seizing the world's most advanced chip-making power. This would allow them to produce their own cutting-edge chips, despite the sanctions from the United States. It would be a total game-changer for global dominance. In short, for Beijing, Taiwan is no longer just a nice-to-have, it is a must-have for their future. And Washington views this situation as a critical security risk. Semiconductors are not just a business matter, they are the core of its national defense. If TSMC were to fall under CCP's hands, American companies like Apple, Nvidia, and AMD would have to rely on China for their most important chips. This would essentially mean surrendering technological leadership to their biggest rival. So the issue of Taiwan is no longer just their own. For the US, the island is the front line of the free world and the last line of defense for semiconductor supremacy. In this way, TSMC has taken on a role it may never have wanted. It is now at the dead center of the power struggle between both countries. Chips are no longer just commodities. With global interests clashing over Taiwan and TSMC, semiconductors have emerged as the most vital strategic resource of the 21st century, and the war has already begun. In this battle, the most fearsome weapon the US has brought out isn't warships or missiles. It is tech control. Do you remember the cutting-edge lithography machines from ASML? They use extreme ultraviolet EUV light to print incredibly fine circuits onto silicon. Currently, the Dutch company is the only one in the world capable of producing these EUV machines. Without them, manufacturing advanced logic chips at the 7 nanometer, 5 nanometer, or 3 nanometer level is impossible. The US struck exactly at this weak point. Although ASML is based in the Netherlands, its machines rely heavily on American technology, meaning they cannot be exported without US government approval. Using this leverage, Washington has effectively blocked ASML from selling EUV systems to China. As a result, China's entrance to advanced chip-making is completely barred. No matter how many factories they build or how many engineers they recruit, they simply cannot produce the most advanced chips without those machines. In this technological war, the US has managed to choke its rival without ever firing a single shot. And the pressure goes beyond much further. The US has formed a semiconductor equipment alliance with allies like Japan and the Netherlands, effectively blocking China's access to high-end technology at every stage. As a result, Chinese companies are still unable to produce top-tier AI chips domestically, and NVIDIA's high-performance GPUs remain under strict export controls. Now, for Beijing, the stakes in Taiwan have never been higher. Seizing the island would allow them to capture a world-class semiconductor ecosystem in its entirety. So, where does China stand now? For years, it has viewed semiconductors as a matter of national survival. Especially as tensions with the US intensified, Chinese Communist Party began treating semiconductors not just as components, but as critical strategic war material. In response, the CCP started pouring astronomical sums of money into the industry, fueling the rapid rise of domestic chipmakers like SMIC and YMTC, alongside a wave of equipment and material suppliers. These investments are starting to pay off. China has already become a formidable player in legacy nodes or mature processes. They have aggressively increased their self-sufficiency in areas like automotive chips, power semiconductors, and display drivers. In fact, their chips are becoming increasingly common in the global market. To say, China cannot make semiconductors is only half true. The country is already churning out a vast quantity of chips. However, the real challenge lies in the cutting edge. To produce chips at 7 nanometers or below, ASML's EUV lithography machines are essential. But due to the sanction, they are blocked from entering China. In response, they found a workaround. They used less restricted DUV machines, and squeezed every bit of performance out of them. And by repeating the same process several times, they managed to manufacture 7-nanometer class chips. The news that Huawei's latest chips were produced this way completely shocked the global industry. However, this is more of a brute force success than a true technological breakthrough. Production efficiency is low, defect rates are high, and the costs are staggering. Even for the same chip, it's far more expensive and slower than the ones from Samsung or TSMC. There's a huge difference between just making a chip and mass producing it. And the real power in this industry comes from mass production. Another major weakness for China is its ecosystem. In this industry, no single nation can succeed alone. It takes design tools, equipment, materials, and decades of accumulated expertise. Beijing has spent a lot of money, but they're still far behind in key areas like EDA tools and high-end materials. As U.S. sanctions expand, closing the gap is only getting harder and slower. Regardless, China will not give up. Their strategy is clear. If you can't catch up at once, outlast them. While they may be blocked at the cutting edge, they are dominating mid-range chips and using their massive domestic market as a shield to buy time. They are waiting for the moment sanctions might eventually loosen. After all, China is the world's largest semiconductor consumer, and this market itself is a formidable weapon. The chip war today is not a simple race to the top, and it's not just about speed. It's about who can survive this war of attrition and seize dominance over the global market. While the U.S. grips the pinnacle of technology, China is steadily taking over the tiers below it. They are essentially chasing the same goal, but through entirely different strategies. So, how will this fight end? No one knows for sure yet. But one thing is certain. This is not a war that will end anytime soon. It is a decades-long marathon, a mix of technology, capital, politics, and national security. Just as fire, the wheel, and the printing press once shifted the course of human history, semiconductors have already rewritten the rules of the world. Now, whoever controls the chip controls the direction of our future. Thank you for watching. If you're still awake, hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. See you in the next one.